Good afternoon, everyone. I am Melanie Roth Gorelick, and on behalf of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA, we want to welcome you to this important conversation on ending racism. JCPA is the national network hub of the Community Relations Network, made up of 125 Jewish community relation councils and 16 national Jewish agencies. We come together to grapple with today's most pressing issues and build a just and pluralistic America in common cause with other racial, ethnic, and faith communities. This is a momentous time in our country. We are having the most significant discussion on racism since the 1960s. People of all different backgrounds are coming together to call for an end to systemic racism. JCPA and NAACP have a common history working closely together to advocate for and achieve civil rights in America. In the 1950s, our two organizations came together and launched the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. JCPA was an engine behind the Jewish community's engagement in the civil rights era, of which we are most proud. Today, we continue to be an unwavering advocate for civil rights in America and to work against racism, hate, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. We launched a criminal justice reform initiative in 2016 and have been activating the Jewish community on criminal justice reform, voting rights, racial justice, and other critical equity issues. Our national, regional, and local JCRCs and NAACP offices continue to work closely together. Today, it is my honor to speak with Derrick Johnson, the President and CEO of NAACP, who's tuning in from Mississippi, and we are so glad that he's with us today. He has a very distinguished career of being a community activist, and he really knows what's happening today, both nationally and on the ground. Derrick, thank you for joining us. This is a very meaningful moment for us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward.
So can we start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to lead the NAACP?
Great. Well, this is a great opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, but more importantly, the strengthening the long-term relationship and partnership. I am currently reside in Jackson, Mississippi, with my wife and kids. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I ended up in Mississippi as a result of going to a small school, HBCU, by the name of Tougaloo College. And it was at Tougaloo College that allowed me an opportunity to deepen my appreciation, understanding of social justice, particularly civil rights, because on this campus, there were many veterans of the civil rights movement who came from the campus and will come to the campus and talk with students. And it was from there that I really deepened my involvement with the NAACP, where I served as the college chapter president, the state youth president. When I went away to law school in Houston and worked on the Hill for a year, I decided to come back to Mississippi to continue my engagement through the NAACP, where I became the state president, followed by a board member, vice chair of the board, now in this position. I can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you now.
Okay. What is your vision for NAACP?
Well, our mission is to improve the quality of life in several areas for African Americans and other negatively impacted communities. That's our proactive mission. The other side of that mission is fight against discrimination. And it feels like in this current political climate, we're doing more fighting against discrimination than anything else. And my long-term vision is that we can move the needle around racism and structural racism, and we can start building a proactive community that's improving the quality of life, that's allowing for our society to be a healthy society measured by three metrics: caring for our elderly, preparing our young people for a prosperous future, and protecting the rights of the disadvantaged, however we label one's disadvantage.
Beautiful. The world has changed so quickly over the past 3 months, and even in the past few weeks. How would you define this moment from the perspective of NAACP and the larger Black community?
It's a moment of opportunity in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. The chaos and uncertainty is around the health pandemic, what we now describe as the racism pandemic, the economic insecurity that many homes are confronted with, the nature of how we police in communities across the country, but the opportunity of an election cycle where we can really put forth an agenda that align a different set of values that we can push. So those who are fortunate enough to get elected, our goal is to make sure they bring those values into the seats they serve in and implement those values into public policy that's going to be necessary for this nation to look forward as opposed to always dealing with the past.
Okay. So the recent pandemic of COVID-19 has highlighted the racial and economic inequities in our country. More than 20,000 Black people, about 1 in 2,000 of the entire Black population in the U.S., has died from the disease. Black people have died from the disease at almost 3 times the rate of white people, higher than any other segment of society. Are these correct statistics? And what can we do as a country at the national and local levels to right these inequities?
Well, as a nation, we have failed the citizens across the board. We are in the midst of a global pandemic that's having national ramification on our healthcare systems, our systems in general, which have created some of the highest unemployment we've seen, and we're still lacking a true federal response. There is no way we can address this pandemic state by state. State geographic boundary lines are artificial. People go between states, and so you don't have a federal response. We're putting all Americans at risk. But the other side of that is the desperate impact it's having on African Americans. We knew because of the communities we lived in, there are a higher rate of respiratory issues because of the toxins and the quality of the environment. We also knew many of our communities live in food deserts where there's not readily accessible quality fresh food. So the diets are not at a place to build immune systems to resist. We also knew there is a persistent policy divide in terms of who are provided access to health care, what communities are not. And when you put all of those factors in the midst of a health crisis, you accelerate the exposure of our community and many communities for that matter. And so here we are. But we have not, as a nation, demanded and received a federal response. The underfunding of the CDC over the last 3.5 years, the taking out of the Office of Pandemic Viruses is another indication. I mean, I can go on, and many of your listeners and viewers know the story. We have a problem from the top all the way down to implementation. We must be considering a new administration because the current administration simply is lacking in an ability to respond to this health crisis.
The killing of George Floyd by police was caught on camera and has brought people to the street calling for a major change to policing. More than 12 national cases of Black men and women killed by police have been brought to national attention over the past 4 years. The NAACP has released a campaign under your name, We Are Done Dying, which really is, every time I read it, it feels very heartfelt. And it's a very heartfelt and personal plea for change. Can you share with us what you see as the change? What do you want us to know and feel? And what reforms do you recommend?
So We Are Done Dying is a campaign that was actually launched prior to what we realized in terms of the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, later George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and just most recently this weekend in Atlanta, Georgia. And we were talking about all of the public policies that are in place that create hazards for our community, whether it's the COVID-19 reality or the lack of quality education. We're done dying. And that is a narrative for us around not talking about the problems, but let's get motivated to get to the solutions. And the solutions for us goes from protest to power. The power of the vote is going to be crucial, but then from power to policy, we must have public policy and corporate policy that look different than the current lineup of policy. For policing, for example, we have to evaluate budgets of police. Now, I want there to be someone to call if there's a domestic violence issue or a child, one of our children being harmed. And we need to make sure we have law enforcement. That law enforcement should not only reflect a value system that appreciate all people, but it also should be aligned with the necessary supports. We cannot have police agencies' budgets continue to increase when in fact crime is decreasing and many of the preventive things that should be in place is non-existent. We don't have a strong mental health support system in too many local communities. If you create a strong mental health support system, you can reduce the number of law enforcement and law enforcement responses because you have the proper preventive measures. We don't have enough social workers in our communities across the board, black or white. And if you have more social workers to address homes where children are growing up in trauma or communities that's trauma-laced, you can speak to the needs of young people before they find themselves in the midst of law enforcement. The whole conversation around analyzing local law enforcement budgets is to make sure that we're right-sizing those budgets to the current times. So the current times saying crime has gone down. There's a need for mental health support. There's a need for social worker support. There's a need for more preventive measures and not reactive measures where we are militarizing the police and ways in which they're responding with excessive force. They lack the ability to de-escalate. We're seeing an increase of violence. We have law enforcement officers, a large percent of those individuals, they don't even live in the jurisdiction in which they're working, nor are they familiar with the communities that they're patrolling.
So what you're talking about is pretty much the definition of defund the police, what defund the police activists are referring to. Can you speak a little bit more of that? I think sometimes the wording and what the results of, when we're outside protesting versus the substantive change that we want to make, we want to be really clear about, what we're looking to, what the change is. Yeah.
But, it's interesting because I asked the question, what does that mean to defund the police? I've received 3 definitions. And so, I didn't use that language, but I think the language I did use is consistent with the spirit of what many people are seeking to do. We need to change the relationship and the nature of law enforcement agencies with targeted communities. So the necessary supports are there and the budgets are prioritized. Local law enforcement agencies, for the most part, very rare occasions, they don't need military tanks. And that's what we find in some small agencies. They would take their budget and go to Army surplus equipment stores and purchase all type of Army type gear. Why is that needed when crime is actually going down? That's only needed if we're talking about terrorism, and oftentimes where we find the terrorists are with white supremacist group, that you don't find the type of aggressive reaction in those communities as you find in communities that lack the level of terrorist group that exists.
Thank you. So I would like to address the elephant in the room. Can you speak to us about the term Black Lives Matter? Previously, this phrase has been perceived by some as being correlated with a movement that was anti-Semitic. Additionally, given that there's been an increase in anti-Semitic violence over the past few years, there's a concern by some about if this current movement, where this current movement stands on anti-Semitism. How do you respond to this concern?
So, and I'm glad, because we have to eat this elephant one bite at a time. We should never have a relationship between organizations like ours and we don't go to the crux of the conversation. So the term the hashtag Black Lives Matter was created by 3 young ladies in the midst of the Ferguson incident. And that was right after the Trayvon Martin situation, the Eric Gardner situation. And these three young ladies very creatively say, you know, this is not right. Black lives actually matter. You cannot dispense away with our lives and just use us as target practice and aggressively police or vigilantly be able to kill us, and nothing is done. There is no accountability. There's no repercussion. Nothing is taking place. And it was a hashtag, not an organization, a hashtag. And that hashtag took off. Well, as a result of that hashtag taking off, there are multiple groups operating under a banner of Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives or the Black Lives Foundation. It's any number of groups. There is no one center of gravity of an organization. Now, there was a set of individuals who created a manifesto around Black Lives Matter. And even in that meeting, there were so many dispersed personalities there that who was speaking for who and what group. You fast forward to 2016 election, the concept of Black Lives Matter became a Russian troll paid for by the Russian government with Rubicons on platforms such as Facebook. These are testimonies that have been verified before Congress. And so there was an explosion of all of these Black Lives Matter for domains and websites that had no relationship to the three young ladies who created the original hashtag or any of the groups. It was used as a political distraction to suppress and subvert democracy. And so people have been reacting to many of the Russian trolls that came out in testimony that had nothing to do with the Black community. Then you fast forward and you find new groups popping up trying to incorporate the name Black Lives Matter. There was one group in California, the Attorney General right now is trying to get a cease and desist order because this person is one person set up Black Lives Matter Foundation, and some of the corporations gave to that, and I realized it had nothing to do with any other groups who were from the Black community, and he wasn't Black. So it is outrageous how this thing has blown up, and people can take a piece of it and run away and say, well, it's anti this or it's pro that and it's against that. And I always say, well, which one of the groups are you talking about, and who specifically said it, and where is this? Now, that's not to take away from, there were some individuals who took a position as related to Palestine versus Israel. That is true, right? But that has nothing to do with the concept that a Black life matter in this society, and we need to value that life like we would value a Jewish life or any life. But the value placed on Black lives have been diminished, particularly when it comes to law enforcement. So when you see the protests springing up across the country, the words Black Lives Matter is not an organization. It is a cry for or being recognized for who we are as human beings. When you see it written in the street in DC and Black Lives Matter Plaza, so that the mayor can demonstrate to this president that we do matter and your responses are important, and you cannot walk out the White House and tear gas peaceful protesters who happen to be Black and white and young and old and male and female that represent all of our religious faith, who's saying that enough is enough. You tear gas them so you can walk in front of a church and hold a Bible upside down that you never read. That's where we are as a nation. We have to begin to recognize how we're all being maligned, and this whole tribal type of approach is being used to divide us, and figure out what is a true moral center of gravity that we want to operate from, and not allow the fringes of any of our communities to pull us apart, but allow the value that we want to bring to the table that we would like to see pull us together. I can't hear you.
Thank you for that. So I really want to underscore what you're saying is right now is the moment for the valuing of Black lives and committing to ending racism in this country. And thank you for helping me to be comfortable to ask you that question. I appreciate it.
Listen,
Right.
It's the only way as communities we can actually build and grow together if we confront some of the hard stuff sometime and talk about it, talk it through. Yeah.
Yes. Both of our communities have come through trauma, and sometimes it's hard to be in the moment because we bring with us our past. But
Yeah.
our moment also is great together. The Jewish community is very proud of its role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and our continued work in this area. And over the past 2 weeks, Jewish people of all ages, groups, and religious streams and colors, from Reform to Orthodox, are standing together to end racism. So how can we bring our communities into greater alignment with each other even after the protests die down? And how can we stand together against anti-Semitism, racism, and hate in our country? And how can we ensure that a younger generation of leaders know each other, build trust, camaraderie, and a common vision for our country? That's a lot, but I'm sending it back over to you.
So I think it's open and transparent dialogue. One of the longest serving members on our national board of directors, he stepped down after being appointed by President Obama, is Rabbi David Saperstein. What a wise individual. You know, everyone loves Rabbi Saperstein, and he was replaced by Micah now, Jonah Carl. And Jonah and I, we have ongoing open dialogue, and sometimes we have to go to those places that are uncomfortable. And if something bubble up and Jonah say, you know, I seen this don't feel right, and I said, oh, let me address it. Or I can say, Jonah, you know, this reaction here, what's going on here? And then he say, listen, our community is not a monolith. And so we have people who feel this way and the people who feel that way. I said, oh, just like around NAACP table. And he fell out laughing. Yes, because we know we both come from very storied history and it's complex, and we position ourselves differently because we have to live through, and in some cases live in the midst of trauma, but it's through understanding that we can pull together. Because, you know, let's be honest, everyone in the Black community don't agree. Everybody in the Jewish community don't agree with one another. So how can we say that everybody that's in the Black and Jewish community all of a sudden gonna have a kumbaya moment? No, we have to understand that what we bring to the table is our individual uniqueness, and through that uniqueness, we have to learn to appreciate those uniqueness, even when we may not disagree, so we can get to a place of solution towards some systemic problems that we all face. And that's
great.
the model. That's the model and example we need to set for our young people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to underscore that same point. I think the relationship between you and Jonah, and that you elevate, that you're in regular conversation, is something that could be modeled and should be modeled at the local level. The more that we're in relationship with each other, proximate, understand each other, can have courageous conversations, and also break bread together, the easier it will be to get through any difficult moments.
It will give you a good example. It frustrates I cuss sometimes, so please excuse me, pray for me. You know, it frustrates the hell out of me. We had a local NAACP here who made some just outrageous comments. Jonah Carl said, Derrick, have you seen it? I haven't. Let me investigate it. He investigated. He came back. He said, Derrick, he's aligned with the Jewish group, and they're also saying the same thing. Right? And so it's like, wait a minute. All right, Jonah, this is awkward. And yeah, we both have to admit, like, we have individuals who may not say the most appropriate thing, but it's really awkward when we have individuals from both of our communities saying they're both saying the most inappropriate thing together. It's like, but that's about being in community with one another. That's about being in a relationship with one another, and recognizing that none of our communities are perfect. None of our communities are monoliths, but all of our communities have a responsibility and appreciation to keep the dialogue going and communicate and respect each other. So when we get those outliers, we can address them, or we can ignore them, whatever we need to do at the moment.
Very important.
Mm-hmm.
What recommendations and expectations do you have for the community relations network around this country at this moment and racism, and what should we be doing for the long game? So
I think the long game for an organization like yours is making sure there's ongoing dialogue with local leaders, which sometimes is difficult within itself, because as our communities understand our individual histories, some of our communities are living through some of our community-based traumas. There are tensions and there are frustrations, and we all have to recognize that if everybody who came to the family reunion was perfect, the family reunion would be great. But we do know when people come to the family reunion, we have the drunk uncles, we have the cousins that are annoying, we have the aunts we wish they would go home at any moment now. And that's the reality in this type of relationship, that we all still come to the table like a family would to continue the dialogue, to make sure that we are in community with one another, because there will be times where being in a community will be the best defense we have when issues arise that can impact either one of our communities.
During the pandemic, JCPA held a delegates assembly. That's where we bring all our local communities representatives together to grapple with major issues of the day. We do education, advocate, and set new policy. And 3 major issues came up for us. We ended up having new resolutions. I was wondering if you could speak to them and what you're doing. One, of course, is on the elections and voting rights and what election mobilization looks like right now. I know we're not in the post-pandemic period, but in the post-pandemic period or between now and the elections, what kind of mobilization work is NAACP doing, and what are opportunities for joint action and getting out the vote during this time period?
Yeah, so for us, we've had to rethink much of what we do when it comes to the election. We are worried about putting people at health risk. Even with all the protests, we are extremely concerned with the result of these protests a week to 2 weeks from now, how people will be, their health will be impacted. So we are concerned about that. As it relates to the election, much of our organizing now have to go to digital platforms and online and sign people up to keep them engaged and do things to keep the enthusiasm level up. That's a challenge because it's new. It's a new type of muscle. Partnership will have a lot to do with where we're situated, how we're situated. You know, we have target areas where we have to fight against vote suppression. And we're thinking through now, how do we deploy both volunteers and lawyers to those precincts to monitor the precincts to make sure access to voting is being readily available, particularly in states where we have early voting, and to make sure there's a comfort level wherever possible, individuals vote by mail so we can get those ballots cast. It is an imperative that we increase voter turnout for this election cycle. We don't endorse political candidates or campaigns. We do endorse and fight for access to voting. And this election, we have to have record turnout across the board because we cannot survive another 4 years of this level of division as a nation or a community.
Amen to that, meaning that we need to be out there and getting out the vote much better than we did in our past elections. Yeah. Another issue really of great importance to us that we've done a lot of work on and we're very concerned about right now is what's happening in prisons and jails, especially around COVID-19. And we have been working to call for decarceration of people and also to ensure hygiene and social distancing and prioritizing the health of those who are still in prison and jail. So I was wondering what NAACP is doing on this issue as well. If you could talk to us for a moment about your larger criminal justice reform work. Again, I know that we already do work together on this, so just to elevate the importance of this work at this time.
So we began to look at what's working in terms of incarceration and COVID, and we landed with a best practice out of Wayne County, Michigan, which is the county where Detroit is located. And the county sheriff have a very innovative approach of how he looked at the county jail, and we think it can be scalable, where he identified all of the inmates who were non-violent offenders with no history of pedophilia or domestic abuse. And he quarantined those individuals and released them under house arrest so that he can free up space. First time, he said that the jail population for Wayne County is below 1,000. He went from like 2,500 to closer to 900. and he hasn't had any problems with that. He then had the complete jail sanitized, and now the remaining inmates have both masks and on and gloves when necessary. He's making sure that wherever possible they are socially distanced. He's making sure the guards are properly being provided medical attention. If they come to work with fevers, he's checking so that the jail inmates are not impacted by the deputies who are coming in and out, and the deputies are not impacted by the inmates who are coming in and out. That's scalable. The cost savings he's realized has been tremendous because he no longer have the number of heads in the facilities. We need to be looking at models like that. Why are we throwing away the key for nonviolent offenders? Particularly when you look at some of the state facilities and federal facilities, nonviolent offenders who are over the age of 60, who've already served out more than half their time, and they have a residence to go to. Why should they continue to be incarcerated? They pose no threat to anyone. There's a greater health risk for them to be in jail. There's a greater cost for us to maintain them in jail. And so long as we are releasing them to a home and not creating an increase in the homeless population, why shouldn't they be released? Why shouldn't they go home? Cohen has already gone home. You had several other people who's been released. That should be done across the board because we have states who are going to be facing sharp decreases in their budgets. How do we alleviate the cost of incarceration while addressing the safety of community and the health of communities? This is a SWAT approach. Can't hear.
Sorry. For everyone who's watching, you can ask questions in the chat box, in the question box that is on your screen. We're collecting questions now. Most of what I'm asking is coming from that. So going back to something we were discussing before, which was building a closer relationships locally, I have a few questions here actually of people asking, how do we approach others locally in the Black community? How do we approach them to begin having these conversations? What is your recommendation?
Well, that would differ from community to community. Everyone that poses community leader are not community leaders. They probably be loud voices. There are spaces that are obvious to some. You know, we have our local leaders across the country. Some of them are very approachable and you can work with. Some of them are not as effective either in their role or with building coalitions. You have the religious leadership of the Black community that oftentimes can be a good group to approach. But it all depends on the community and the institutions that are in those communities.
Thank you. You mentioned about protesting and the risks of protesting. Would you recommend, would you make the case for going out right now and protesting, and why? Why is it important to right now advocate with your feet during this COVID period?
So we created a heightened criteria to approve our units to organize marches. And we did that because we want to make sure the march is not only relevant to an outcome they are pursuing, but we're keeping the participants safe from the health risk. So one, the march that you organize in your local area, how would it have a direct impact on policy or an issue that you're trying to advance? And so you have to describe what that is. Two, what precautionary measures are you going to take in light of the health crisis that we're in? Are you providing masks and distancing? What's your plan for that? Three, are you prepared or have arranged for march training? There's a protocol that we put in place for marching to ensure individuals don't infiltrate the peaceful marchers and create a distraction by inciting some type of violence or riotous behavior. And then fourthly, and this is mostly out of control, what contingencies are in place for you to disband the march in case this administration seeks to federalize law enforcement and attack marchers. So you have to give us a description on how you're going to address those four issues. We did that very intentionally so the marches can have purpose and relevancy and an outcome in mind. The march can have be something that consider individuals' health and safety, both from the health risk, but also safety from individuals who would infiltrate the march to create the distraction. And finally, after watching that horrific scene outside the White House for this administration to go take a photo op, we want to make sure that's not repeated and there's a plan to disperse so people are not harmed as a result of escalation, military escalation.
Thank you. So our last question is, what are the three things that we should take away with us today? What can we do? What were the three things?
First, for us to continue to grow and build relationship and community, we must be an ongoing dialogue. And that dialogue have to be real dialogue. If there's elephants in the room, we must eat the elephant one bite at a time, but we got to address it because we cannot allow it to be there because it truly will create a disingenuous engagement. Secondly, elections matter. Not only are we done dying, we have to have the ability to move people from protest to power. Power is at the election box, and then from power to policy. Getting the right policymakers in place leads us to really designing a policy landscape to help us look different than what we look now. And then thirdly, partnership. How do we figure out places where your membership can engage with local leadership and understanding that none of our communities are perfect and we must accept the diversity we all bring to the table and identify who are the real leaders in local communities from both communities so that we can open up some local opportunities together.
Thank you, Derrick, so much. I know this is a really busy time for you, and I appreciate that you took the time to speak to us. I didn't tell you personally that my whole family's from Michigan, and both my parents grew up there, although I'm the only one, me and my sister, who grew up in New York City.
Wow.
So I know it well. But I want to thank you for speaking with us on ending racism in America and helping to frame out what steps are needed to take place in this country in a real way that touches people's lives and strengthens our democracy. So thank you so much. We wish you to go from strength to strength and look forward to working closely with you. I want to
thank you. I look forward to the opportunity to do it again. And you know, your members join the NAACP. We've always been multiracial, and we appreciate being in conversation with people across all communities.